I was born in New York. My father had a theater which he eventually opened up down in Baltimore. And one day a rather skinny little lady came walking in and from New England, and an actress, and he wouldn't give her the time of day, and my mother said, "Pay attention, this girl's got something," and it was Katharine Hepburn. And that was the beginning of her career. German Jewish family. My father's brother was Alfred Knopf, the publisher, 7 years older, and my dad was in competition with him his whole life because Alfred was a bloody genius. My mother, for some odd reason, people gravitated to her who were in the arts. Heifetz was one of her close friends. Later on, George Gershwin proposed to her, and she turned it down for my father. And when I heard about it later on, I said, "Mom, how could you have done that to me?" We eventually, in the early 30s, I was born in 27, so I was about 5 or 6. The sister, who was about 4, went to Germany. I guess Dad was directing films there. Got out when Hitler came in, came back, depression, broke. Dad was broke. And Samson Raphaelson, who was a writer, said, "I got a farm up in Maine. You can have it for the summer if you'll pay the taxes." My mother couldn't boil water, but there was a farmer's wife named Stover who taught her how to cook, and Mother eventually ended up writing 9 cookbooks. She was an extraordinary woman. Dad, well, that was my beginning anyway. He eventually came out to California in I'm not sure when. It was in the middle 30s. He went to MGM as a story editor, wanted to produce, they wouldn't let him. Sam Goldwyn said, "You come over here and you can produce." And it was very clear that all Sam Goldwyn wanted was his connection to the Knopf publishing house. Dad optioned a play, The Trial of Mary Dugan. He wrote the screenplay himself, sold it to MGM, and he went into contract there in 1939 until 1960. Dad was a good producer. He came out of a network of producers in the 40s and the 50s that are rare today. They knew everybody's job. They would take a writer who turned in a first draft to Palm Springs for a weekend, not to play, but to hole up in some condo somewhere for 48 hours and work on that screenplay. He knew the director's job. He knew the cutter's job. That art got lost. I think, in my opinion, producers, ended up becoming stars' husbands, wives, whatever they were, and lawyers. You look at some of the shows today, you see the titles: producer, 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 and they're not producers. I think it's rare today to find the kind of producers that I encountered and that my father was back in the 40s and the 50s. I came to California, I guess I was about 7. I went to school, ended up going to a private school up the coast called, originally it was called Catalina Island School for Boys. I was there on a partial scholarship, which I didn't know. They never told us. And in 1941, the war broke out and we were thrown off the island, and we ended up combining with a school that was our arch enemy in everything, in sports and academics and everything else, called Kate, which is up in Carpinteria, California. Only 10 of us agreed to go, and it was a kind of a unhappy experience, the only unhappy experience I've had in my whole life, the 2 years I was up at that place. A lot of anti-Semitism. I was the one that could pull out of the closet to prove they weren't anti-Semitic. And it's the only time in my entire life I have had an unhappy experience. After that, I went to in the Army. The war was just over, and they took us down to the streetcar, red car station down in Los Angeles, where the the draft board was and said, you're going to get drafted or you're going to enlist. If you enlist, it's 2 years. If you're drafted, we don't know how long you're going to be in. So I enlisted in the Air Corps, and I had a great time. And got out, and then I ended up going to Berkeley. And I did Berkeley in 3.5 years. We all did, because you want to get going, and we went around the clock. And we took 15 units was the average. We took 18, sometimes even 7, sometimes even 20, and majored in English literature. And that was my educational experience. Actually, when I was in the Army, I started doing some writing. I did a little bit of work on a newspaper, and when I was at Berkeley, I took some writing courses, and I took a writing course from the first thing that happened actually was that I remember writing a paper for a philosophy course, and I got a B on the term paper, and the professor wrote, he says, as usual, you can move your reader. He says, but your spelling is atrocious. So he marked me down to a B. But that kind of piqued my interest. And I took a writing course from a novelist named George Stewart. It was a very fine writer. He wrote Earth Abides and Man, some awfully good novels, Fire. And I wrote a novel that stayed in college, but in those days, it was 1950, and Dore Schary had taken over to run MGM Studios, as I recall, and he was a very close friend of my father's. Now, in those days, television had not made an impact on the motion picture industry, so it was easy to bring in the sons or the nephews and everything else, and they called us trainees, junior writers. I was the only, of the group that came in at MGM, I was the only one interested in writing. There were 7 of us that George Kirgo later on called, because we were turned over to Charlie Schnee, who was a very fine writer. And George Kirgo later on dubbed us Schnee White and the Seven Dwarfs, which I think was great. But anyhow, Dad was a very tough taskmaster, and if I didn't do my 20 pages in a week, I had to come in on Saturday and Sunday and do them. And I remember one day, I turned in a scene, and I said, the room is, I wrote, the room is decorated in the period of the Times. And he said, what's that mean? And I said, well, you know. And he says, no, I haven't a clue. And so I said, I'll show him. So I wrote a full page describing the room. He says, that's pretty good. He says, now do it in 10 lines. I did it in 10 lines. He says, now do it in 3. And there was a writer at Metro named Millard Kaufman, and most of the people at MGM, the writers, didn't take me very seriously, rightly so. Millard did. Millard said, you're better than you think you are. He took me under his wing, and he was writing Bad Day at Black Rock in those days, for which he got an Academy Award nomination. He let me read the screenplay, talked to me about it, let me receive the dailies, snuck me into the dailies. Snuck, is that a word? Sneaked me into the dailies. And read my work and helped me hugely and built my confidence. So I did one motion picture over there called The King's Thief with a very good cast. David Niven and George Saunders and Ann Blythe. And Roger Moore, of all people, was his first role in film. And it wasn't very successful. It was a swashbuckler, and eventually television was coming in, and television made major inroads into all the studios. MGM never took television seriously in the early days. What they did is they began to staff it with the people who had failed, who they thought were second-rate talents, and they got second-rate material. And I was not considered even that good, so out I went. When I left MGM, it was all motion pictures. I did about 4 or 5 of them. An Audie Murphy Western, a Joel McCrae Western, a Ray Milland 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 Western, a Ray Mil And no television. As all people in the motion picture industry in those days, we were terrified of television. You had to do it so fast. In movies, you know, you took 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. Television, sometimes you had to do it in 3 days. That's absurd. You know, who ever heard a thing like that? But the options for me were becoming more and more limited. There was a man named Vince Fenley, and I did a little tiny movie for him over at Allied Artists, which he shot. And Vince said, I'm going into television. I've got a show called Trackdown with an actor named Robert Culp. Are you interested? And I had no other options. So I said, okay. And it worked. And I developed a relationship with Vince, who was brought into 4-Star, which is run by Dick Powell, which is one of the happiest experiences of my life, and anybody's life who worked at 4-Star. Believe it or not, we all rooted for the guy in the next room to make it. At 4-Star, I began doing all the half-hour westerns they had. It was Ain't Great Theater, Wanted Dead or Alive, which had an unknown actor named Steve McQueen in it. And then one day, and I was just delighted to be alive, delighted to be, you know, making my $1,250 a show. And Vince was great because Vince would say, I'm going to Hawaii, give me 3 scripts when I get back, and which is a great luxury. But then Vince inherited a sinking show called Alcoa Goodyear. And he had a commitment, had 2 commitments with Jack Lemmon. And Jack Lemmon was huge to me. I never worked with anybody like Jack Lemmon. Steve McQueen at that time had not become a star. I tried one idea after the other, and nothing worked. And then one day I hit one, and Vince said, write that. Now, it was over New Year's, and I'm a big football fan. So I spent my time between watching all the football games and writing this thing, which I wrote in 3 days. I thought it was just awful. And I turned it in, and I got a call from Jack, who I tried to duck, and he says, I don't even have to memorize this thing. It's just so real. I said, you're kidding. And he said, no. And I got an Emmy nomination for it. Now, in all candor, I didn't get an Emmy nomination. Jack got it for me. If it had been anybody else, it wouldn't have happened. But his performance was just brilliant. Just 2 men across a desk from each other in a police station, the whole show. I promptly panicked because the idea of me qualifying for an Emmy nomination was just unheard of in my mind. Let me back up and tell you why. I had a very, very controlling father. Now, I think he was trying to compensate for the fact that his father had been very controlling with him. And literally, if we go shopping for a coat, I'd pick out a coat and he'd say, that coat. So I really had very little confidence at this time in my own judgment about anything. And now they're saying, give us another great one. Now that word great is thrown around in this town very promiscuously. It doesn't mean anything. It means one we can shoot. And Fate and Exterior Thee is not very great. And for 3 months, I couldn't write. With 3 kids and wife and a brand new house, I had to. So I did eventually and pulled out of it. And I went on a contract to 4-Star, which were the glory days for me. They're the best days I ever had in my life. I was there for about 4 or 5 years. The people that Dick Powell brought in, he brought in Sam Peckinpah for a while. Bruce Geller later created Mission Impossible and Mannix. Gene Roddenberry was there for a while. And the way Dick ran his operation, there was Dick Powell at the top, there were 2 story editors, and then the producers and the writers. And the producers and the writers fought it out with the ad agencies, who in those days controlled television. There were no vice presidents that you had to go through, or heads of development or anything else like that. It was as simple as that. He had a show called The Dick Powell Show, which was a very prestigious show in those days. It was an anthology. It was an hour show. He paid the highest price that any writers were getting, which was $6,500, which is pretty good for an hour show in those days. And he got big stars who would never do television, except they'd do it for him. And you go in and tell Dick an idea, and he would cut off the telephones, and nobody could get through to him. He listened very carefully, and when you were all through, he would say, okay, this is what I think you said. And he'd tell you back what it was you had said to make sure that you knew that you'd been heard. And when you said, yes, that's it, he'd say, okay, I like it, or I got to go against it. But you knew you'd been heard, which is very rare, because sometimes you come out of these meetings, you say, the guy didn't listen, didn't hear what I had to say. And, but it was terrific, and I did several of those. Unfortunately, Dick got cancer, and he died, and it was taken over by a man named Tom McDermott, who came in from an ad agency in the East. And Tom ran the operation very differently. He brought in a huge amount of executives that had nothing really to do except watch for glaciers coming over the Santa Monica Mountains. We all wanted out of our contracts, and he wouldn't let us out. And one day I took a project into him, and it was a good one. It's a good idea, I thought. And he wouldn't take it to the network. And I couldn't understand why. Nothing to lose, take it to the network. And then I found out why. A project had been brought in called Big Valley by another writer, brought into three friends of mine, Levy Gardner Laban, that I liked very much. I'd worked with them before on other shows. And it wasn't the same show at all, but it was a family situation. Theirs took place in the San Joaquin Valley. Mine took place in San Francisco. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. And he said, then you're on suspension. So I went down to see Levy Gardner Laban, and they said, what would get you to write this thing? And I said, one, pay me $10,000. Two, get me out of my contract. And they did. And I wrote it, and it became Big Valley, went on for 4 years. So it was some Pyrrhic victory there, and that was my experience with 4-Star, which everybody adored Dick. And Dick was a very conservative guy, and he used to say, if my aunt in Little Rock doesn't understand it, it's not going on my show. And he had these wild-eyed Jewish liberal writers around him, who wanted to save the world. But the thing about Dick was this, two things about Dick. If he really didn't get it, and sometimes he didn't, but you delivered for him, he let you go ahead and do it. And if I did one show where it was written for him, and he wouldn't play it because it was a story of a hero who turns out to be a coward in the end. Well, we got Robert Ryan to play it. In those days, it was a big movie star, and it came out, and Dick took an ad out afterwards in the Variety recommending this thing. I think it won an award. I'm not sure. Called Interrogation. I know it did. Called Interrogation. So Dick was like that. He never held grudges. He only got mad at me once when he said, I can picture Khrushchev reading this and just loving it. And I only got mad at him once. No, let me reverse that. That's when I got mad. He got mad at me once when I said, Dick, you're not the star of the show. The story is wrong. You don't say that. I was at 4-Star really from 1957 to 1960, went under contract in 1960, left in 1963. So I was there about 6 years. 4-Star really folded after that. When I left 4-Star, they had just the one show. They had just the Big Valley. Everything. Dick had 13 shows on the air when he died. He just could do it. He'd also say, if it was marginal, look, I'll do three guest appearances, 4 guest appearances. After that, I got into, I did Dr. Kildare with Walter Matthau. I think I got a nomination, the Writers Guild nomination, I'm not sure, I think it did. And then I got into 2 areas. I got into movies for television, and I got into movies again. I did a lot of movies for television. I did some series. I did a couple of series I got on the air. The motion pictures that I did with Emperor of the North with Bob Aldrich. I told the story to Peter Bart, who at that time, who's now head of Variety, but he wasn't then. He was Bob Evans' right-hand man at Paramount. And I told him this idea, and he said, "You want to do that here?" And I said, "Sure." And we did it here, did it there, but it didn't go into production. Everybody was interested in it, couldn't get it made. Sam Peckinpah wanted to do it, and wanted more money than they were willing to pay him. There were others. George Seaton read it and said, "I'm too old for this." It was a story of a tramp during the Depression called A Number 1, who has a reputation of being able to ride anybody's train. And he comes up against Ernie Borgnine, who's the conductor of a miserable 4-car freight train who has a reputation that no hobo can ride his train. And they go at it. And basically the theme was how far men will go to preserve the illusion of their own importance. And which raises a question about how do you start what elements do you need in a story, and what elements do you need to start a story, which I'll get into in a second for you. The deal was that Paramount owned it for 2 years, I owned it for 2 years, and at the end by the 4th year, when I had about 4 weeks to go, that I owned it. By owning it, that simply meant that I could take it any place I wanted to, as long as I paid them back what they'd invested in it, which wasn't that much. I think I got paid $40,000 for it, and it was an original idea. My agent got a call that Paramount wanted to buy me out. And I said, "What's to buy out? They wait 4 weeks, it's theirs." And I said, "Don't do it, something's going on." Well, what went on was that Bob Aldrich, who was a very famous director, had been given a stack of scripts at Fox, and at Paramount, and said, "This is the one I want to do." And eventually he took it to Fox, and that's where he shot it. I liked it. I wish Peckinpah had done it. I think that Bob had developed a kind of a technique of very broad action. I mean, he's got scenes in there now where someone gets hits on the head with a hammer that would kill him. The guy shakes it off and gets up, and he got a little cartoonish with his action, I felt. He's a nice guy. But I did another show with him later on. Then I did one with Kirk Douglas too, called Posse, another original. Now the interesting thing about Posse was a story of Kirk Douglas, who was a marshal, head of a group of brilliant men, all of whom have a specialty, but none of whom are leaders. And the whole idea is what happens when the leader is taken away. And that all started with the Black Tower. This is my attitude toward these organization men at Universal who will, sell their politics, their wives, their religion, anything. Just don't ever put them in a position of having to make a decision about anything. Therefore, they can't fail. And that was, believe it or not, that was the basis of Posse. That was the story of it. I did a lot of movies of the week, not really after a Posse, but in between, back and forth. I got into a situation with CBS, Marion Brayton and her Marion Brayton's specials at CBS. Now Marion had her own unit there, and if you were on her team, you worked for her forever, and she just trusted you. And you could call Marion up and say, "I got an idea," and she said, "Let's do it. What is it?" And it was another. 4-star was the cream of the crop. Marion was pretty close. I did 4 for her. I did a 3-hour special on the life of the last pope with Albert Finney. I worked for a terrific producer named Beth Polson when we did couple of shows with her, and then we did other things as well. But almost everything I did with her ended up getting some kind of an award. She was terrific. She let you alone. She let you do what you wanted to do the way you wanted to do it, and she supported you. She would fight for you. She wouldn't say, wait a minute, hold it, this is what the network wants, or this is what the public, trying to move these things around into something that wasn't supposed to be. And the result was very good. When women first began to come into the industry in executive positions, let's say program executives of the network, you'd go and tell them an idea, and they'd say, I love it, I'm going to fight for that. The guys would say, I'll get back to you, let me talk to my people. The women hadn't discovered yet that, hey, wait a minute, if you make a mistake, it's going to cost you. The men had realized that, so they didn't want to be responsible for saying yes to something that wasn't going to fly. So I've just had great luck with women executives and producers. The last thing I did was in the late 90s, called Equal Justice. I was under contract to Orion. I was partnered with a younger fellow named David Simons. So David was a producer. I was a writer. I never really had been a producer, and I didn't like producing. It bored me. And I wasn't very good at it. I'm not good at numbers, as a rule. And he wanted to learn how to write, and I'm going to learn how to produce. And we'd written a very good pilot, I think, for ABC. It didn't go, but Thomas Carter, who is a director who's got about 9 shows that have gone on the air, done pilots, read it, and he had an idea about young district attorneys in a place like the Bronx. And he wanted to work with us. And he came to Orion, and we went on the air. We wrote the pilot, and we went on the air with it. And we were on 2 years. And I think we made one mistake. We had a cast of about 8 people, and we tried to give everybody equal time. But we had one young woman in there named Sarah Jessica Parker. And had we built that show around her, because she was the neophyte, she was the young one coming in to this really scuzzy world, and the shock of it. Had we really built it around her, I think we'd have done much better. But I had actors coming into my office constantly saying, you gave so-and-so a role last week. I want one like that too. So I was assigned the responsibility. I was in charge of the writers. I was a co-executive producer, and I was assigned the responsibility of trying to balance all this out. But I think we made a mistake in not just building the whole thing around her. I started in 1950, and it was now around 2000. I'd done a couple of more shows after that, and I didn't like what the network was saying yes to. It just wasn't for me. It wasn't what Marion Brayton was saying yes to. Marion Brayton's department had been collapsed by the network. They were going for what they called high concept, which is not my cup of tea. I had 50 years in. I just also, the industry changed totally. In the beginning, it was all relationships. And you inevitably met the person who could say yes or no. And now you're going through a group of people, often who are sitting there praying to God they can say no. Because if they have to say yes, they have to go up and try and justify it and try and remember what it was you said. God, I remember I had one meeting at CBS. I'm not going to tell you who the exec was. But all I'll tell you is that it was she. She's listening, telephone comes, she's called out. You go ahead and keep telling my assistant. We kept telling the assistant. She came back in 15 minutes later, and I said, where we are. She's, sorry, I know just where you are, keep going. This kind of stuff was going on. And it was, I just, I always lived frugally, to save my money, and I just got kind of tired of it. And 50 years was a long time. That was my reasons, I think, for dropping out. But I didn't, two reasons. One, 50 years, and two, I think the business had changed so. In my opinion, the producers in motion pictures, many of them, have become deal makers as opposed to people that are dealing with the talent, whether they are above the line, below the line, you know, working out the material, working out that screenplay. Give you an example. When Equal Justice folded, I got a call from Thomas Carter one day, and he said, got a call from George Lucas. They're doing a show called Red Tails, which is a story about the 99th Fighter Squadron, the Black Fighter Squadron put together in World War II, Tuskegee Airmen. And I've sold you to George, and he needs a rewrite. I read the first 3 screenplays I had. There was no reason to replace the first writer. He was a very good writer. In my opinion, the show was way off. I couldn't understand what they were doing. I met some of the Tuskegee Airmen who were still alive, and they said, please don't embarrass us. These scripts were embarrassing. They were jokes. Airplanes coming in and flying and bouncing around on one wheel and kind of for laughs. I met George up in his place in Northern California. He's one of the nicest guys I've met in my life. When he goes down into the cafeteria, he gets to the end of the line, doesn't barge the line. Everybody calls him George. He's a nice, nice man. And when I started talking about how I wanted to do the show, and I wanted to do it the way these people really, what happened to these guys. They were kept out of the war deliberately because nobody felt that they could make it. They eventually end up being incredible. Well, when I was talking, he had a sheet of paper in front of him. He had 3 sheets of paper, actually. And it was listed 1 through 100. That's all I could tell. And I thought maybe he'd outlined the story as he wanted it to go. The way he wanted it to go was a celebration of flight. And I said, George, this is not a celebration of flight. This is a story about prejudice. And when he got up to go to the bathroom, I took a look at what he had. It was the 100 most successful movies of all time. Because every time I would talk, he was running his finger down. So was it like this movie? Was it like this movie? You can't do that, in my opinion. But this is what he was doing. Anyway, I wrote the screenplay, and it was a good screenplay, and Thomas was thrilled. And so was the producer who had been signed. And George says, it's not what I want. He says, I'm not going to make a $40 million movie where no one's going to come see it. That's what he said. Anyway, I don't fault him for that. It's his money. But 4 writers is not necessary. That first writer was good, and they should have stayed with that first writer. That's what's happening today. David Milch went on, I don't know how I got on this subject, but I guess because the way things have changed. David Milch got on Larry King, and Larry King said, why aren't you doing movies? He said, I'll tell you why I'm not doing movies. He says, I've got a friend. He says, I've just bought a novel. He says, it's worth 10 writers. That's why I don't want to do movies today, because that's when you do an arbitration, you're looking at 4, 5, 6, 7 writers who've been assigned to a project. It's ridiculous. It's not necessary. That's the producer's fault today, because they don't know how to work with writers. Raises the question about mentoring, thinking about that. 2, Millard Kaufman at MGM in the beginning, and then a magnificent writer, Walter Brown Newman. He co-authored Cat Ballou. As a matter of fact, well, on Santa Monica Boulevard, just west of La Cienega is a tailor shop, or was. Above that tailor shop was a network of buildings, little warrens, little offices. And the tailor loved writers, and there were a bunch of us up in there. And Walter Brown Newman was in there. And I got one of the offices. And then Walter was like a guru. Every writer just was fascinated, just literally sat at his feet. Harvard educated, brilliant guy. He wrote, I guess, the best screenplay that's never been shot in the history of this town. As a matter of fact, that's what the LA Times said one day, and everybody's read it. Called Harrow Alley. Brilliant bloody script. The library should have it because it's just a classic. One day, Walter appeared in my office door, and he had a little worn, yellow-paged book called The Road by Jack London in his hand. And it was opened, and he drew about an 8-page little chapter in it. The Road was a story about Jack London when he was a tramp. And he said, I think there's a movie here. And that became the basis of Emperor of the North. It was a story literally about how a tramp rides a train when the train master doesn't want him to. And Walter was probably, and this was in the early 60s, that I started my relationship with Walter. Walter, after Millard, was probably the one that gained me confidence in myself as a writer. Those are the two best mentors I've had over the years. Now, thinking about people I've mentored myself, I taught at USC for about 5 years. And I don't know if I mentored anybody. There was one kid, Guston Nash, who wrote a screenplay one day. And I said, Guston, this is better than I can do. And I called Alan Gasmer at William Morris. I'd gotten Alan his job over there years before. And I said, I've got somebody you got to read. And he said, I'm sick and tired of hearing about these USC students. I said, have I ever called you before? He said, no. I said, read them. He read them. He called me back and said, send them in. They signed him. He's now writing, directing movies. Did I mentor him? I don't know. It was one class. I've had other writers that I've run into during the strike who were in my class, who were now members of the Guild. And some have said it all started with you. I don't know that that's true. I think they're just being nice. I don't really feel I've mentored anybody. I think I've been part of a group of writers. It's a funny thing. Everybody wants to be Pygmalion. Everybody wants to discover somebody, and if you get somebody that's pretty good, you give them as much as you can. But I suspect that those people who are good, who've been given something by me, have been given something by others as well. So I think it's a collective thing. Let me talk about how I get an idea and whether or not I think it's going to make a movie. I'm an Aristotelian. Aristotle's Poetics, which is about 30 pages long, no one has ever come close to beating it. It absolutely sets down the unity of writing. You can depart from it if you want to, but it's a great way to start. It's so simple. Act 1, revelation. Act 2, suffering. Act 3, resolution. Let's take High Noon as an example. Revelation is that the bad guys that he put away to clean up this town are coming back to kill him. Suffering, he goes through this town desperately trying to get the town to help him and nobody will. Resolution, what happens? Hamlet, simple one. Revelation, father comes to him as a ghost and says, my brother, your uncle, killed me, took your mother, nail the sucker. Act 2, suffering. He spends the whole time trying to figure out what he's going to do about it. Act 3, the action that he takes was suicide. So because he can't make his mind what he wants to do. Those are the unities. That works for me. Doesn't work for somebody else. That works for me. I have an innate suspicion of these people that go around and give these great lectures about how writers should write, and you look up their credits and they have none. They're probably pretty good for people who've never written before. For professionals, I think they're a waste of time. I'm sure that's going to cause a little controversy, but that's how I see it. And I'm not alone. Now, how do you get your ideas? You can have a character, you can have a theme, you can have a situation. You can have a location, if you want. Character, well, the one that I got the Emmy for with Jack Lemmon was a character. It was a loudmouth. It was called Loudmouth. It was a guy who's at a party one day, 8 people going to play bridge, and on the television, they're saying that there's been a couple of silk stocking murders in town, and they're getting crank calls. People calling up admitting they did it and that sort of thing. And the next time someone calls, they're going to prosecute. And there's Jack Lemmon on the telephone over there calling in, giving some crazy wild story about how he did it. And nobody thinks is very amused by it. Well, they trace the call and they bring him in. And they begin to weave circumstantial evidence around this guy. And you're dying for him. At the very end of the show, you find out that he really did it. I went down to the police station and talked to the captain in Beverly Hills and said, "Is it possible?" And he said, "You bet." He says, "When you commit murder, you're God." And he says, sometimes you got to talk about it, even in a joke. That was a character. Theme. Posse was a theme, which I think I dealt with. Situation. Situation was Emperor of the North. Riding a train. How do you do it? Why? Who would they be? And you have to fill in the other elements, bring the other elements into it. I find writing extremely painful. I've only enjoyed writing, as I look back on it, once, where when I wrote Fade Out, I wish I didn't have to, because I hated giving up the characters. I'm diverting, but it's relevant. Prokofiev wrote the Lieutenant Kiji suite. Lieutenant Kiji is a legend in Russia about things are going badly for the Tsar. 3 officers invent a character who's doing wonderfully well on the front. It's all a lie. The Tsars, and they fall in love with the character. He's alter ego for them. The Tsar says, "Bring him, I want to meet him." And they kill him. And they're killing a part of themselves. Well, that feeling of distress is when I finished. This was called The Girl Who Spelled Freedom. It got an Emmy nomination. I hated finishing it. Mostly, I just love writing Fade Out. I find it very, very painful. Every scene, to me, is a movie in itself. It has the unity structure. It's a 3-act structure to me. Beginning, a middle, and end. Now you can come in on the end of Act 2. You can come in on the end of Suffering and then play out Act 3 if you want. But I circle every scene like it's going to destroy me. And you're facing failure every single day. People say, "Oh my God, it's wonderful." And you know in your heart of hearts, it's 80% of what you really had in mind. It's not 100%. It's very hard to reach 100%. I've done it a couple of times, but it's rare. Some people say, "Well, I just gobble up writing." I don't trust those writers. They gobble up writing. I think it's a very painful process, and it's very difficult, and because you're always shooting for something better, and it's not easy to make it. Not easy to do it. How do I know if it's going to work or not? One of the best screenplays I ever wrote. I wrote it for Lee Remick. I loved it, and she did too. And then she got sick, and they canceled it, and it was never shot. I had a bet on that one, so you never know. You never know. Loudmouth, I thought was awful. Emmy nomination. You don't know. You just don't know. I don't know anybody that knows unless you got a guarantee on the air kind of thing. My preparation is my own, and And incidentally, it's a very interesting way of breaking writer's block if you have it. I just start free associating. The worst thing you can do, I'll take that back. The worst thing I can do is try, when you're breaking a story, is to say, what happens next? What happens next? To force yourself into construction too early. When you don't really know your characters, when you don't really know the situation or the, the surprises in it or the twists in it, I just free associate. I put down every single thing I can possibly think of in no order whatsoever. I just put down stuff. It could be a line of dialogue. It could be a character description. It could be an idea for a scene. Just pages and pages of it. And what happens when you're doing that, all of a sudden things start to emerge. And you begin to get an idea. Then I go over it and I eliminate stuff that is of no value whatsoever and rearrange things. And all of a sudden, out of the mist, you begin to get a sense of what your story is all about. That is a very good way of breaking writer's block when you don't know what to do next or how to do it. Just to free associate, just to let it go. Otherwise, you're going to sit there and just stare at the blank page for day after day. And very often, writer's block comes from the fact that you're going up the wrong road. I'm writing a screenplay now where I reached a certain point. I thought it was just great. I didn't know what happens next. Telling the wrong story. I had no place to go. I was telling the wrong story. And I backed up completely and came in a different direction. And I'm having I'm having fun with the idea. It's very hard to accomplish it, but the idea is very good. Done a huge amount of research. When I did John Paul II, I went over to UCLA to get some books on Poland, and I suddenly found they went from 18 feet of books on Poland. I read books on the papacy, on the Curia, and met with priests. Had one bizarre experience. I flew back to New York to meet in Staten Island the priest who was supposed to know more about John Paul II than anybody alive in the United States. Two things happened. One was I found out I knew more than he did. Second thing is we're sitting there at lunch one day, and I don't know how the subject of Roosevelt came up, but it did. And suddenly he put his hands together and he said, about the day he died, he says, "I thanked God when I heard he was dead." I was shocked. But there was a priest down here in St. John's. No, that's not St. John's. In St. Monica's, I think it is, in Santa Monica. Monsignor O'Flaherty. And I spent a lot of time with him, and he was great. And but research, I think, is terrific. I did immense research on Emperor of the North, a huge amount of that, dealing with that period, and other things of that nature. When I did the story of Not My Kid, which is a story of a doctor whose 15-year-old daughter gets into drugs, and he finds out, as you peel back the layers, how deeply involved she is, and he's going to take care of it. He's going to fix it, like hell he is. And I got into a great deal of research. I went back to a drug rehab center for teenagers in St. Petersburg. This research has helped me hugely.